I remember last year I read a book for class. Just to make it clear, I don't read books for school, I skim them. There is a big difference here because I'm not an intellectual of any kind. If you're reading my stuff thinking I'm some smart dude and my shit makes sense to you, then go make an opinion on that topic by yourself. Do your own research and have your own informed opinion with that research. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. I don't usually read books, but I did read this one properly, and not just because my class forced me to. No. It's called Canada's Odyssey, a country based on incomplete conquest by Peter H. Russell, and it's a great book on the history of Canada and how complex the history of Canada is. It deals with many different events that have led to the creation of Canada to arguably become the multicultural country it is today, and what led to the creation of our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. Now, this isn't a book review, so if you've already tuned out, then as a Canadian, I am both sorry and I get it. What I want to say is that the book also deals with how Indigenous peoples in the territory of what would become Canada have been treated and how it's especially relevant this week. For example, Indigenous peoples have never lost a war against Canada. Now, there was a time when the British authorities in what would become Canada saw Indigenous peoples as equals almost. But let's be real, they were still racist. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 arguably gave the Indigenous peoples of Canada a sense of self-determination and accepted what would be their territory. From now on, all interactions were to be done with treaties. So if there was never a war that dominated the Indigenous peoples of this region, then are we allowed to force them to do anything on their turf? Well, apparently the answer to that after January 11, 2019 is that we don't give a shit. We can do whatever the fuck we want. Remember that multi-billion-dollar natural gas pipeline in British Columbia that people were protesting against last year? Yeah, last year cops came in and just broke down the barricade and arrested like 14 Indigenous protesters. Well, people are still protesting, with little news coverage now. And recently, members of the, watch me butcher this, I apologize, Wet'suwet'en in British Columbia built a barricade again in their own territory. Now, the company behind the pipeline, Coastal GasLink, posted a 72-hour notice for any opponents to clear the area, supported by a BC Supreme Court injunction. But what's unclear is how that legality holds up in the territory. In most parts of Canada, there have been treaties where rules are set in place on how the Canadian government and different Indigenous groups will interact. This isn't really the case in most of British Columbia, especially for the Wet'suwet'en. Some of their chiefs are against the gas pipeline, and as leaders of their people, that voice matters. I mean, from the research I've done, all these chiefs want is to not taint their own water supply. Anyone reading this, or listening to me, I should say, would understand that. Fuck, I love clean water. Well, apparently their voice doesn't matter, and that's messed up on multiple grounds. The question for me and most people would then be on the grounds of sovereignty. Sovereignty is basically the authority that one state has to govern itself. If the Indigenous populations of Canada were never conquered, nor did they all agree to join Canada, which is the case for the Wet'suwet'en, then what right does Canada have to destroy their barricade? In my unprofessional opinion, absolutely none. I feel like all Canadians should know these stories of our dark history in terms of how we've treated Indigenous populations in Canada. I can speak for myself at least. We got residential schools that could be blamed for generations of mental health issues. Read about that on your own time. We also forget the sovereignty of Indigenous communities when it benefits us, and then we conveniently remember when it comes to helping them out. For example, oh, your water isn't clean? I'm sorry, that's your problem. Oh, you want to protest on your own land? You're going to want to run away on your snowmobiles as fast as you can. Yeah, that's kind of what happens. Now, this shit, it goes down to sovereignty. And the reality of the situation is that we sorta just stopped treating Indigenous communities as equals, as we got more powerful as a nation. That doesn't make it right, though. Indigenous communities should have a voice because we never took that away from them. And if they have a voice, we should listen to them. If we can't listen to their voice, why should anyone listen to ours on the international stage? We think of ourselves as so civilized, and yet at the end of the day, it's all about gaining more resources. We have enough in Canada that we control, and while the issue is far more complex than this, please read more about the history of these conflicts. I can only say so much before I lose your interest. Now, I mentioned a book earlier, Canada's Odyssey, A Country Based on Incomplete Conquest by Peter H. Russell. I'm not being endorsed by this dude. Professor Russell, if you're hearing this, please give me money. I'm poor and rent went up. Now, it was a good book that brought me information on the topic, but definitely on your own time, go ahead and research. Watch YouTube videos and listen to podcasts when you're out and about. Canadian history can sound boring, but there's interesting shit out there. Like, did you know our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, was known for being a raging alcoholic? Don't get me wrong, he was great when he was sober, and usually sober for a good period of time. Man made a country, with the help of a few others, of course. But when he drank hard. We're talking, he'd forget about what happened during the day on campaign, or he'd be so drunk he couldn't speak in Parliament. Now, everyone drank in Canada back then because whiskey was so fucking cheap, but I'm starting to get off topic again. If you're going to take anything from this post, please read more about Canada's history, and remember, sovereignty is important. If we could respect the sovereignty of another country, then we should respect the sovereignty of our neighbors, the Indigenous peoples of North America included.